So,
Hi everyone. We are the Communicreatives. Haha, you get it. And I'm Ania.
hi, Monica.
I'm Rick.
And our theory is The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by John Gottman.
So, taking a look over the overview of what the four horsemen of the apocalypse takes it back from the last book of the New Testament called the Book of Revelations in the Bible. And it kind of depicts God holding a scroll with 7 different seals on it. He takes out 4 of the seals, and it represents the 4 horses that ride out the white, red, black, and pale horse. And the 4 riders that come out symbolizing conquest, war, famine, and death, respectively. So, in this Christian apocalyptic version of the Last Judgment, Judgment Day, kind of these 4 horsemen set out to have the fine judgment on the world, or like the hairbringers. But in regards to our class, which is not that scary, the theory used in communication of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is dubbed by John Gottman as a theory to just predict the end of a relationship.
And more specifically, marriage is what he was looking at within relationship context.
Yeah. And so the four horsemen, they don't technically have to arrive in any specific order, but the first one, criticism, is typically the first to arrive. And I think it's the most common in a lot of relationships. So criticism is very similar to complaining, which Dr. Gottman believes is actually very healthy. He says that complaints are a way to express grievances in a constructive manner, while criticisms are targeted. So a criticism takes a complaint and kind of targets it at an individual, attacking the individual instead of complaining about the action. And the phrases "you always" or "you never" are really common here. And those are 2 phrases that Dr. Gottman says to try to avoid at all costs. So an example in my life, my most hated chore is doing dishes. My girlfriend and I always end up with a very large stack of dishes next to our sink before either of us cleans them. And during one period of time, I felt like I had been doing the dishes like almost every time, which led to an argument where I said, "You never do the dishes," which is not true. And a more constructive method would be to phrase it more as a complaint, talk about the behavior more, make it less targeted. Something like, "It bothers me that there are frequently unwashed dishes next to the sink."
Okay, and looking at like that phrase, it bothers me that they're frequently unwashed dishes by the sink. I automatically think of how like I would react if like my partner said that to me, and I almost read that as passive aggressive. So I guess it really depends on your relationship and the types of ways that you do communicate with that person to understand like how they might perceive some of the phrases that you are putting out there. So like these are just some examples, but they might not work in every marriage, in every relationship as well.
Right. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, learning about like all these, taking criticisms and rewording them to make them more constructive. Like almost every example I've seen just kind of sounds awkward. And like I think it's because criticism is so common. Like we're all so used to criticism that things that sound different just seem a little off.
True.
Yeah.
I think I engage in criticism a lot, which is something I have to check myself on too. Like you were saying, it's so persistent and common in a lot of different
Hmm.
relationships. And I think what I would keep in mind is like, how often am I complaining? Like, am I ever taking time to recognize things that they do? So when they do the dishes, am I like, hey, thanks for doing the dishes? Or am I only having conversations about dishes when it's not done? So criticism can be
Right.
balanced out. And if you're someone who engages in that, think of different methods that you can start pointing out the positive things that your partner does in a relationship.
And I think criticism is it's really common and really becomes a problem when it becomes like too prevalent, because then it can lead to why it's always or almost always the first horseman. It can lead to the other ones.
Do you think criticism itself can end a relationship?
I kind of going off of what I just said, I feel like it usually has to like lead to something else, like lead to one of the three other horsemen before it really has that effect.
Mm-hmm.
So how are those dishes now?
They are almost always still dirty, but less criticism going on.
That's good.
So it hasn't ended the relationship.
It has not ended the relationship.
Good.
So I guess it's
Oh
yeah. I guess it's a good way to lead on, because criticism can then lead into contempt.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So in Gottman's concepts, contempt is the second horseman concept, which kind of like criticism, it attacks your partner, but this takes it a step farther in dictating a need to be superior over your partner. And according to Gottman, contempt is the best predictor of a permanent separation. It's also the single most corrosive behavior in a couple's relationship. Contempt is usually fueled by long, simmering negative thoughts about the partner, which then heeds into the perpetrator's attacks and accuses them from a position of relative superiority. So in a sense, it could be said more like in a regular relationship, kind of just overstepping and kind of being more of like, you can't complain because you're pretty much the worst negative thing in the world. And like the contempt is also mostly thought of as the most disgusted language you can probably throw out at your relationship other. So an example of this can be seen in my friend's relationship. Sorry, but she once told her boyfriend of 2 years that day in and day out, she's always making food for him every day, working 35 hours a week and going to school full time. And he claimed that he was exhausted. And her first word was, "What's wrong with you?" So this comment that kind of just came out of frustration was built up, and it kind of led to like, you shouldn't be feeling exhausted because I'm exhausted. And it kind of led their argument to continue to escalate into words of anger, blame, and disgust. Like, forget lovey-dovey relationships. This one looked like it was someone's gonna die. Anywho, the relationship ended a couple of days after the argument, but you kind of wonder why this leads to like such poor communication, and like what happened in that situation. And a way to kind of combat the idea of like losing a relationship or going into contempt is kind of like in Gottman's antidote, which like kind of states a way to combat contempt is to remind yourself of the positive things in your relationship or of that person, and take gratitude for these positive actions. And regularly expressing, appreciating gratitude, affection, and so forth helps create a positive relationship. And he kind of threw out these like this magic ratio of 5-to-1, having 5 be for more 5 positive reactions to every 1 negative interaction helps benefit your relationship and keeps it going, rather than having it end or being a determiner of the end of your relationship.
Yeah, when I look at contempt, I think of like the ultimate petty. So it's like you're literally being petty. You lose compassion for your partner. So you're willing to go, like, you're willing to do little things to really get underneath their skin and bother them, and you have no regards to their feelings. So I think that one's dangerous. I'm curious to know, like, where would y'all rank contempt out of these 4 horsemen?
I think, as Dr. Gottman says, like it's the like leading predictor of permanent separation. And I agree with that. Like, to me, contempt seems more serious than the other ones. I find it interesting, like the order of them and how contempt is like the second horseman, but the like most significant.
I kind of thought like because it leads in, like criticism leads into contempt, it would be the second one. But because of how Gottman said that it was the one that was the single most corrosive behavior in a relationship, and it's also the predictive of permanent separation, you kind of think that would be the last one, right?
Right.
So
But I guess when you think of like the process of an argument, I could see how contempt would follow criticism and come before the ones that we haven't gotten to yet.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, then moving on from contempt, let's look at what defensiveness is. And keep in mind these traits may be present in healthy relationships, but the trouble once again is when these traits are constant and they're manifesting in very toxic ways. So defensiveness is the act of placing blame on the other individual in the relationship and disregarding one's actions and role in the dispute. Someone who is defensive in a relationship may position themselves as the victim all the time. Some theorists have compared the traits of defensiveness to having a behavioral blind spot. According to Professor Douglas at Harvard, he described these blind spots as traits about ourselves that we literally can't see, such as our own facial expressions and body language. Our inability to see these behaviors do not mean that they don't exist, but the other partner in the relationship may see them and call the other person out. And as a result, this may feel like criticism to the individual who is not aware of their behavior or may fail to accept and acknowledge their behavior.
So going off that, what are some behavioral blind spots that can be toxic in a relationship?
One that I notice or that like someone has called me out on is being manipulative. I have a friend who was like, Ania, you're acting manipulative, or like you have manipulative traits. And that word just has such a negative connotation. I was like, oh my gosh, no, she did not call me a manipulator. But in reality, she didn't call me a manipulator. She just said I engaged in these traits. And I had to actually take a step back and say, like, this is someone I trust and I know what they're saying is coming from a position of love, to realize, like, in some instances, I might make a situation and make it so it benefits me. And to others that might be manipulating, but my intent is never to hurt someone in that process. So that can be toxic as well.
So in a sense, you kind of took a step back and then took in this kind of criticism, and instead of going towards contempt, you went the other direction?
Yes.
Wonderful.
And it all depends on the relationship. Like if it was a random person, I'd been like, oh no, like down. But if it's a friend, like I trust that it's coming from a place of love. So that did help.
It sounds like your friend didn't really criticize you. They were talking about the behavior, and it, like, I think what kind of like the key to all of this is that constructive communication is like an antidote to all four of them.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't have those, well, oops. Oops. And other blind spots that Douglas highlighted was the impact our actions have on others. Because the impacts may not present itself on the surface, these tie into defensiveness because someone who engages in this behavior oftentimes does not see their own wrong. One way people who resort to defensiveness can work through it, instead of assuming they're right, is take a step back and re-examine themselves and how their actions contribute to the present conflict. And I do recognize that's a lot easier said than done. But if you are willing to work through a relationship, there's times where you have to examine yourself.
So
yeah.
Do you have any, like an example of defensiveness from your own life?
Yeah. Okay, so with this theory, it is in the context of marriage, but I thought about it like how I process through this outside of marriage. I know in high school, I went through my quote unquote rebellious years. And my mom would ask me to do something such as like clean up or babysit my brother, and I get defensive. And I literally find every excuse in the book as to why I was not able to do those things, such as I'm tired, I'm stressed out. But what did I have to be stressed out at 15? Sports, like everything was so overbearing. And so she would constantly say, I need you to do these things. And since she was calling me out all the time, I took it as nagging. instead of simply understanding that she wanted support in the house. So now that I'm older, like instead of me taking the blame or acknowledging my own actions and doing, I would get frustrated. But now, like I know what I need to do, in order to avoid that conflict. So like overall, all of this can be solved through clear communication as well. If I communicated back to her better, she communicated with me better, I think we would have avoided a lot of conflict.
I feel like that's probably like in the previous example for contempt. Like, how did that conversation go between the two people who both felt exhausted? Like, I feel like there was probably a lot of defensiveness happening after those statements about feeling exhausted, and like both of them probably just going back and forth about who's busier than the other one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then the next one is stonewalling.
Yeah. So yeah, the final horseman, stonewalling, and that is when one person completely shuts off communication, and that's not just like talking back and forth. That's also completely shutting off like verbal and nonverbal cues that the person is listening. So when someone stonewalls their partner, it usually appears as if that person doesn't care about the conversation, or maybe even doesn't care about their partner. But in reality, the person who is stonewalling usually just feels overwhelmed. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Dr. Gottman, the heart rate, and like once you reach that threshold, stonewalling often occurs. So the person stonewalling feels overwhelmed, or they feel like anything that they say will make the situation worse. But even though they feel that talking would make the situation worse, stonewalling actually does make the situation worse, because the person who is being stonewalled feels like they're not being heard at all, and that leads to an increased heart rate in the person being stonewalled, and more stressed that way.
So,
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
So you kind of mentioned how stonewalling can shut down or make the situation worse, but in different cases, could it be a different way where someone is like, I know I'm right and there's no point arguing anymore, rather than trying not to make a situation worse?
I think like what we've kind of said throughout this, like just any communication like is better than none. Like direct communication is an antidote to all of these. So I mean, maybe not phrasing it as I know I'm right, but like I think just trying to be more like persuasive, or any communication is better than just shutting down because you think that you're right. Yeah. And stonewalling it's like my go-to. I am definitely a stonewaller. When conflict arises, I just almost immediately shut down. And I think it's interesting to think of this like not in a relationship setting, but going back to like my childhood. I unknowingly stonewalled my parents all the time, but for the purpose of making them upset, which is not really the reason why most people end up stonewalling. But now that I'm in a relationship, I'm trying to break this habit, because especially after reading about how any communication is better than no communication, even if you're not really talking, at least giving cues that you are listening.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh.
Let me unmute.
Okay.
I think we can go into criticism of this theory that flows nicely from what you said. The theory focuses on marriage, and I have already brought this up too, but can include many examples of how, well, this is the criticism. It focuses on marriage, but is not inclusive towards other relationships, but I think for most of us, we gave examples outside of marriage, so it can be applied in different areas.
Yeah.
So in some criticisms of the theory, it kind of pinpointed different areas of the Four Horsemen. On criticism, for example, it's like, I believe that there's nothing inherently wrong with giving critical feedback, as I think it's healthier, actually. Kind of, we all do it. We don't really stop doing it, whether or not we say it out loud or not, or on the inside. And pretending that there's something inherently wrong with criticism as is a recipe for self-deception. I feel like it's what you take in and bring out from that criticism, whether or not you take that and attack someone, versus what if their character is actually wrong. So like your criticism, like on not doing the let's see, you criticize someone for not doing their laundry and they're wearing their same clothes over and over again. Is it wrong to say that when they're actually doing that?
I don't know the answer to that.
But it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That idea. And then, do you have anything?
I don't have anything toward that example specifically. Are you able to clarify on that?
It's kind of more like, because of his first horseman, it was talking about how criticism like is attacking that person, versus if attacking that character is wrong, is giving criticism wrong, especially when you're in a committed relationship.
No, I think we covered that too. It's like criticism is not necessarily wrong. Like we all do it. There are different ways that we can rephrase it so it doesn't hurt that person as much. So I don't think it's wrong. It's really just the language and how you communicate with that person.
Yeah. And like, I think criticism, just like complaints, like they can both be used to air grievances. It's just a matter of phrasing.
And then on defensiveness, it was, I don't know if it was ever mentioned, but what's the difference between defending yourself versus being wrongly accused or misunderstood for being defensive or engaging in defensiveness? What would you say?
So like, to a certain extent, you can't just let people like you have to defend yourself to some extent. I guess that's another, like, it's a matter of phrasing, like when are you being defensive and when are you just actually like defending yourself.
Yeah, and two, it's like if someone actually does something wrong and like, I don't know how to phrase this, but I think the difference is if you're constantly positioning yourself as being right when engaging with defensiveness, that is the problem. But if you've already evaluated yourself, and this person who is communicating with you is doing something worth defending, then there's absolutely nothing wrong. And then lastly is stonewalling that had criticism.
Oh, yeah, I just wonder with stonewalling, especially when you're going to that point of your argument or in your relationship, is when you stop listening to someone, it's either, is it permanent or temporary, depending? So I feel like temporary stonewalling may not be an indicator that it's very toxic for your relationship versus a permanent idea. So
Yeah.
I don't know if they had a distinction between those two.
Like, how long do you have to stonewall for it to really be considered a horseman of the apocalypse?
Exactly.
Yeah. But there are, I guess, one like really significant value of this theory is that a lot of it was really quantitative. There's just like a bunch of data. Dr. Gottman has been doing this for decades. It's not just like anecdotal evidence. There are so many married couples that have come into his lab. So much data. I think it's like different from a lot of the other theories we've learned about in this class. Is just like how quantitative it is.
I agree. So thank y'all for listening to our discussion. We hope that you learned something out of this. And if you have any comments or questions, please do leave them for us to respond to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.